I always thought I had it all. A husband who seemed devoted, a home filled with laughter, and a social life that made everyone envious. On the outside, our life looked flawless. Friends would comment on how lucky I was, how perfectly we fit together, and I would smile, nod, and believe it myself. But underneath the surface, little things began to shift, subtle cracks in the foundation that I ignored. He would arrive home later than usual, claiming work, but there were times I caught the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his coat. He smiled at me, yet his eyes sometimes flickered elsewhere, distracted, distant. Invitations I once received were postponed, conversations cut short, and secrets whispered in hushed tones when I walked into rooms. I brushed it off as stress or coincidence, telling myself I was imagining things. I never imagined he would choose someone else over me. Every laugh, every shared memory suddenly felt fragile, as if the life I knew could shatter in an instant. It started with a notification I couldn't ignore, a message from someone claiming they'd seen him out with another woman. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was gossip, that my imagination was twisting harmless encounters into something sinister. But then I saw it for myself. A tagged photo on social media, his arm around her waist, laughing as if I didn't exist. My hands shook as I scrolled through messages I hadn't meant to see, snippets of flirtation, secret plans, invitations I wasn't included in. The humiliation was suffocating. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity, the way he had so casually stepped into a life that didn't include me, as if I were invisible. I replayed memories in my mind, searching for signs I'd missed, questioning every moment we shared. Friends and acquaintances had seen him with her, whispers following me everywhere, and suddenly I realized I had been publicly outmaneuvered, underestimated, and dismissed. My perfect life was unraveling before my eyes, and there was no way to ignore the truth. After the initial shock faded, the world around me seemed to shift overnight. Friends who once called daily now offered awkward silences, uncertain glances, and carefully measured words. Some whispered, "Maybe he's not the one," while others seemed to quietly side with him, as if my pain was inconvenient or embarrassing. Even family, who I thought would be my anchor, began asking questions with a faintly accusatory tone, their eyes scanning me for flaws I didn't know I had. The isolation was suffocating. I remembered the nights I had stayed up worrying about bills, smoothing over his work stress, managing social obligations, and quietly sacrificing parts of myself for the life we were supposed to share. The trips I'd skipped to save money, the career opportunities I'd passed up, all seemed meaningless now. Every gesture I'd made, every compromise, felt invisible. The very people I'd leaned on now made me feel like the outsider in my own life. I was left with nothing but the echo of my own thoughts and the bitter taste of betrayal, wondering if I had ever truly mattered to anyone. Night after night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every smile, every conversation, every promise we had made. Sleep became a stranger, and when exhaustion finally took me, dreams turned into nightmares of him with her, laughing where I should have been. I cried in silence, letting the tears soak into the pillow so no one would hear, so no one could see the cracks forming inside me. Doubts clawed at my mind. Was I too naive, too trusting, too small to be enough for him? Memories came unbidden. The dinner I cooked alone while he canceled plans with me, the time I rearranged my schedule for his convenience, the nights I waited for him to call and he didn't. Moments I had treasured suddenly felt like betrayals in themselves, proof that I had been overlooked, taken for granted, undervalued in ways I hadn't allowed myself to see. I felt hollow, trapped in a life that seemed to belong to someone else. and the weight of loneliness pressed so heavily I thought I might collapse entirely. Somewhere between despair and exhaustion, a flicker of clarity emerged. I began to notice his arrogance, the way he flaunted his betrayal as if it were a trophy, careless and unguarded. Every brag, every smug smile, every underestimated glance became a piece of the puzzle I hadn't seen before. I realized that the same man who thought he had all the power was blind to the opportunities right in front of him. I began to plan, not recklessly, but deliberately, imagining the ways I could reclaim not just my dignity, but my life. In my mind, I rehearsed every move, testing scenarios, calculating consequences. I whispered to myself late at night, imagining the shock in his eyes when he realized that I wasn't broken. I was strategizing. The thrill of possibility replaced some of the pain, giving me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since the betrayal, I could see the path forward, and it was intoxicating to imagine the reversal, the tables turning, the scales of power finally balanced in my favor. I spent days immersing myself in possibilities, researching luxury investments, high-end ventures, and ways to quietly assert influence without raising suspicion. Every article I read, every meeting I arranged with consultants and advisors added another layer to a plan that was beginning to feel tangible. I reached out to friends in business circles, people I had always considered acquaintances, and quietly gauged their interest in collaborations that could benefit me and, indirectly, unsettle him. With each small step, I began to reclaim pieces of power I hadn't realized I'd lost. A subtle email here, a discreet call there, and suddenly the narrative was shifting. I noticed the first small victories. A minor social misstep of his corrected before anyone else noticed. A business opportunity he overlooked that I claimed. These little wins, unseen by him, fueled my confidence. For the first time, I felt the balance of power tilting, the quiet thrill of being underestimated working entirely in my favor, and I knew that the bigger moves were only a matter of timing and precision. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, but with each deliberate move, I felt myself stepping back into my own power. I didn't need grand gestures or explosive confrontations. Subtlety was far more effective. My husband had always believed he operated in a world too complex for me to grasp, too strategic for me to challenge. That arrogance became my greatest advantage. The first opportunity arrived during a charity gala, one of those events where appearances mattered more than the cause itself. He thrived in that environment, shaking hands and exchanging rehearsed laughs, his image polished and pristine. But he had overlooked one detail, the small lie he told about his involvement in a community project, something he claimed to have led but had only attended once for photographs. I quietly mentioned the truth to a well-connected board member during casual conversation, framing it as admiration for how busy he'd been and how he'd only managed to drop by briefly. The board member's surprise was immediate and visible. Later, I watched as she questioned him publicly about the project, leaving him fumbling for words. It wasn't catastrophic, but it cracked the perfect facade he depended on, and I knew he felt it. Another move came through social channels. A mutual acquaintance had posted about a business development that contradicted a story he'd bragged about to his friends, something about closing a deal he'd barely contributed to. I innocently reshared the original post with a congratulatory comment to the actual lead on the project. It took less than an hour for the circle to realize he had exaggerated his role. No accusations were needed. The truth simply surfaced, right where everyone could see it. The sideways glances he received over the next few days were more effective than any confrontation. Then there was the subtle shift in his professional network. I began speaking with people he underestimated. Assistants, coordinators, second-tier managers who knew more about the inner workings of his world than he ever realized. I treated them with respect, asked questions, and listened, and information flowed. Not scandals, not secrets, just small inconsistencies he thought no one noticed. Missed deadlines he blamed on others, meetings he skipped, promises he made but never followed through on. I didn't expose everything. I only nudged the right truths in the right directions. The effect was slow, but undeniable. His reputation didn't crumble, but its shine dulled. At home, he sensed something shifting but couldn't pinpoint what. He grew irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences, scrutinizing conversations more than usual. But he still believed I was fragile, broken, too overwhelmed by the affair to be paying attention. That belief kept me hidden. It kept me powerful. The audience watching this journey would feel the tension. Each small victory a pulse of satisfaction, each moment of his unraveling a preview of the storm building under the surface. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't surviving. I was strategizing. And he had no idea that these early moves were only the beginning. As my small victories accumulated, I realized I didn't have to face him alone. People I had once considered distant friends or casual acquaintances suddenly became invaluable allies. A colleague I'd helped years ago now offered insider advice on his professional dealings. A mutual friend, who had quietly observed his manipulations, was willing to lend subtle social support. Even some of his business rivals, unaware of my personal motivations, became key players in my strategy. I met them discreetly, framing conversations as curiosity or networking, never revealing the full extent of my intentions. Each connection expanded my reach, giving me information and leverage he could never suspect. The thrill of seeing these hidden alliances take shape fueled my determination. I began to imagine the impact when these threads converged, a carefully orchestrated revelation that would leave him unprepared and powerless. For the first time, I felt truly in control, and the tension of the approaching reckoning electrified every thought I had. The moment I had envisioned for months finally arrived, and I executed it with precision. Every detail had been planned to maximize impact without giving him any warning. I arrived at the exclusive gala he prized, dressed impeccably, radiating confidence, while whispers about my subtle influence in recent business ventures rippled through the room. Friends, colleagues, and rivals alike took note, their eyes flicking between me and him, sensing a shift in power. I subtly referenced investments and connections he had ignored, highlighting projects I had quietly secured in his absence. His smug smile faltered as murmurs spread, people realizing he had been outmaneuvered. A social rival he had dismissed approached me, congratulating me on a deal he hadn't anticipated, further undermining his stature. I could feel the satisfaction in their glances, the subtle humiliation sinking in. He attempted to regain composure, but the energy in the room had changed. The tables had turned completely. He was no longer untouchable, and I stood at the center, calm, powerful, and victorious, reveling in the second full-scale reversal of our fractured dynamic. The aftermath was more devastating than I had anticipated, and yet entirely satisfying. He, who had once commanded attention and respect wherever he went, now fumbled through interactions, his usual charm replaced by awkwardness and unease. Invitations he had counted on vanished, subtle snubs from colleagues and friends piling up like small, insistent reminders of his missteps. Conversations that once elevated him now turned into arenas of scrutiny, each word weighed and questioned. Meanwhile, I moved through the same spaces with calm assurance, my presence commanding respect, admiration, and even envy. People whispered compliments, shared nods of acknowledgement, and recognized the quiet power I had reclaimed. The contrast was stark. His confidence dismantled by exposure, his influence weakened by my careful maneuvering. I, composed and radiant, stood firm at the center of attention, the orchestrator of his downfall. Watching him stumble while I thrived was not cruelty. It was the satisfaction of justice, a cathartic reckoning that left the audience exhilarated, their sense of moral balance restored. Finally, I arranged a moment alone with him, away from the prying eyes and whispers of society, a space where the truth could hang between us unfiltered. He approached with that familiar smirk, as if he expected apology or desperation, but I no longer needed his validation. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady but sharp, recounting his betrayals, the lies he had woven, the arrogance that had blinded him. Every word was deliberate, a mirror reflecting the man he had become under scrutiny, powerless and exposed. I spoke of my sacrifices, my silent endurance, and the cunning patience that had brought me here. Not for revenge alone, but for the reclamation of my life. He faltered, searching for a retort, realizing too late that I had never needed his recognition to define my worth. I walked away from the confrontation calm, composed, untethered by anger, carrying the quiet triumph of someone who had grown beyond the need for approval, someone who had transformed pain into power and humiliation into liberation. Sitting alone that evening, I allowed myself to breathe, to finally process the whirlwind of events that had consumed me for months, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the meticulous planning. It all coalesced into a story of survival and reclamation. I reflected on how I had once measured my worth by his attention, his approval, his fleeting affection, and realized how powerless that mindset had left me. Now I saw the lessons clearly. Strength isn't shown in confrontation alone, but in the quiet, deliberate steps that reclaim dignity, respect, and autonomy. I had learned to trust my instincts, to value my own capabilities, and to embrace my worth independently of anyone else's validation. The toxic relationship that had once defined my life no longer held sway over my emotions or my future. I felt empowered, liberated, and morally vindicated, as if the universe itself had realigned to reflect the justice I had earned. For the first time in years, I was free, and I knew I would never allow anyone to diminish me again. Even as I basked in the triumph of my calculated comeback, a quiet weight settled over me, a reminder that victory always comes with cost. Some relationships I had cherished were forever changed. Friends who had remained neutral now kept their distance, unsure how to navigate the aftermath. Family members who had chosen sides spoke in clipped sentences, their warmth replaced by cautious civility. I realized that reclaiming my power meant losing pieces of the world I had once known. Nights were still quiet, but they were tinged with reflection rather than sorrow. I thought about the man I had once loved, the life I had envisioned, and the trust that had been irrevocably broken. The luxury, the social victories, and the strategic triumphs were intoxicating, but they were accompanied by an undeniable emptiness, proof that empowerment and revenge, while exhilarating, could never fully replace what was lost. Yet, despite the loneliness, I felt a strange peace, a recognition that I had endured, evolved, and emerged stronger. The emotional cost was real, but so was the liberation, leaving a lingering resonance that would shape me forever. In the months that followed, my life transformed in ways I had only dared to imagine in private moments of ambition. I traveled to places I had once dreamed about, stayed in hotels that felt like palaces, and experienced experiences that reminded me I was capable of more than I had ever allowed myself to believe. My social circle shifted, not through manipulation this time, but through genuine respect. People admired the quiet strength I now carried, the poise that came from enduring betrayal and turning it into power. At work and in business ventures, I commanded attention, influence, and authority, my decisions respected and my vision trusted. I learned to relish solitude without loneliness, to celebrate achievements without seeking approval, and to feel joy without apology. The mirror reflected a woman transformed, elegant, confident, untethered from the past, and radiant with self-assurance. Even when memories of him surfaced, they no longer brought pain, only the satisfaction of knowing I had navigated every betrayal, every slight, every moment of doubt, and emerged victorious. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and hurt. But now I stood as someone wholly untouchable, a woman who had not only survived, but thrived, commanding her life on her own terms. And as I looked out over the horizon from my private terrace, glass of champagne in hand, I smiled, thinking, I am finally free, and nothing will ever take that from me again.